Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Open Source Summit North America. We are very happy to have everyone here for our virtual conference. We wish we could have seen you live, but unfortunately, these are tough times. This morning, we have an amazing group of speakers and a few special announcements. In particular, I want to start with an announcement from our Open Power Foundation. Today, the Open Power Foundation is announcing that IBM's A2I Power Processor core design and associated FPGA environment is being contributed to the open source community. It's available right now on GitHub. This is an in-order, multi-threaded 64-bit Power ISA core that was developed as a processor for customization and embedded use on system-on-a-chip devices. It was designed to provide high streaming throughput while balancing performance and power. You may be familiar with some of its work. The A2I was used as the general-purpose processor in IBM's Blue Gene Q family of systems, which helped advance scientific discovery over the last decade. Mendy Firmenich and James Kalina, President and Executive Director of Open Power Foundation, are leading a session at 2 p.m. Central Time today in the OS Project Updates track. Definitely tune in and learn more about the A2I Power Processor contribution. Our first speaker this morning is also from IBM. Todd Moore, Vice President of Open Technology, IBM Developer and Developer Advocacy, and Camilla Sharp, Global Business Line Executive for IBM's Software Support Business, are joining us to talk about trusted AI. Our world has changed, and environmental and social factors are taking AI models into new territory. They will discuss how we can come together, promote ethical AI use, and trusted models to drive our world forward. Please welcome Camilla Sharp and Todd Moore.
Hi, I'm Todd Moore, IBM Vice President for Open Technology. Today I want to talk to you about something that's near and dear to me, a topic that I've talked about before actually at one of the Linux Foundation open source events, and that's trusted AI, responsible AI. We're in a world today that is caught in a pandemic. We have a global health crisis that depends on data. And how we collect that data and how we make effective use of it can save lives. At the same time, we're in the midst of a global movement around race and equality. And these things intersect, and they intersect with how we handle AI, our models, our data, and where we go from here. At IBM's core, our values are those of equal rights. And these are long-standing policies that go back to 1953 and Thomas J. Watson, where he put in place policy letter number 4 that stated that IBM would be an equal opportunity employer and that we would not have bias as a result of race, color, or religion. Now, Arvind Krishna has also taken up this task. Arvind has taken the IBM company out of facial recognition. So here's one avenue that will no longer be available for uses that could create bias in our society. And he's opened this up to public dialogue as to whether this technology makes sense and how our society should handle it. But trust and transparency in AI goes beyond just facial recognition. As the data that we collect gets used, privacy issues will certainly be at play. Ethics of how that data is used, how it's transformed, how we as a society respond, all need to be sorted out. Now, IBM has been providing tools. We've open sourced a number of projects. We have a robustness toolkit. These are all Python libraries. We have a fairness toolkit that looks for biases within models and data. We have an explainability toolkit that allows you to very quickly look at the black box that is potentially your AI model and turn it into something that you can recognize how it's behaving. Right? These are essential things that will help us go and take bias out of it. At the same time, we're also working now on what we call AI fact sheets. And here will essentially be how we hold models accountable. Think about it in terms of like the labeling that you have on food products, right? They took a long time to develop, but once they did, you get quite a bit of information out of it as to what's actually in that can of soup that you have. And that's what you'll find as we go and develop this project as well, too. Now, these projects have progressed, and what we find is that the Linux Foundation AI organization, where we want to see these in open governance, has a TAC, and they voted positively to now incubate these projects. So you'll see all three of the ones that have been out and open sourced available through the LFAI organization. So we thank them very much for doing this, and we think it's a great place for others to come join in and openly shape and drive this work forward. We think it's important to society. The group already has quite a few really important companies who are involved, and universities as well too. There's a trusted AI committee that we would hope that any of you who can would come and join, because they've been developing the principles by which we will take advantage of and use the models and the data that are coming out of the AI technologies involved. So they have 7 principles that have come from the work group: equitability, reproducibility, transparency, governance, privacy, security, accountability. These are the 7 principles that they are working on right now as we speak. So please come and join that. Now, since the last time we were out there and talked about this, I just mentioned obviously AI fact sheets have come into play, and we're starting to open source those. But the AIF 360 group has worked with Scikit-Learn and RStudio, and now have made themselves available. The KUFO pipelines for MLOps are out there now, and we can do fairness and adversarial detection on those pipelines. And MLOps has taken a step into Apache NiFi, and we now have a processor available as well. So all the projects are also making great progress, and thank you for the folks who have been contributing. Again, I think this is a really important thing for our world.
Okay, let's switch gears to something for just a moment. I have with me Mariana Villa, who represents a group in Colombia, the largest community of women in tech in Colombia. And she's here with me because IBMers each quarter get a chance to vote for the organizations that they feel are really deserving of community grants. And we started this back last year, where we've been giving out essentially $50,000 worth of community grants to really deserving folks out there. And it's $25,000 in cash, $25,000 in cloud credits. And it allows them the freedom to do as they would like, as well as to be supportive of the organizations with cloud resources, so that they can also use those for good. And so I just wanted to introduce Mariana and have her just say a few words about the great things that you do, because you really captured the hearts of the IBMers involved, and you overwhelmingly were voted in this for this quarter.
Hi, so thank you so much for inviting me to be here, and to thank you to all IBM employees, because they trust in our purpose, and we are really grateful to be here, to be selected to this wonderful grant, because it's hopefully it supports our cause with creating more impact in our community in Colombia and in our region, Latin America region.
Thank you, and you do great work down there, and you've spread to all sorts of areas that really, are underprivileged, that need the support and the help, and we at IBM really love what you're doing. So thank you very much, and we appreciate everything you're doing down there.
Thank you. We are super excited because this is our first grant. We are creating this community with no resource. We receive a little amount of resource for local companies to create meetups and have like our t-shirts and our legal registration as a foundation in Colombia, but we never tried to apply to a grant. because we believe that we need to be sure what was the right moment to do it. And right now it feels like really amazing to have this opportunity, to have this resource to create more impact, because our dream is to reach 7 countries in Colombia, main cities. And we have a special project in rural areas when they don't have like a network or connectivity. So our dream is impact more indigenous people, and perhaps we have an African really hard African heritage, and they don't have the same opportunities here in Colombia as our in the main city. So we are trying to reach the rural areas and try to create an impact in other places.
Excellent. Well, thank you again. Thank you for all the great work you do. Organization is very deserving, and hopefully this won't be the last time we get to see you.
Thank you, Todd.
Thank you.
And now to talk about unlocking the full value of open source, I would like to introduce Camilla Sharp, Global Business Line Executive for Technology Support Services here at IBM. Camilla.
Thanks, Todd. My name is Camilla Sharp, and I'm the Global Business Line Executive for IBM's multi-vendor software support. I'm very excited to be speaking today at Open Source Summit North America. This is an event that I participated in myself, and so it's just a pleasure to be here. I've actually been asked to speak a little bit about IBM's open source support practice. Now, as Todd mentioned earlier, we are all experiencing an unprecedented time in history right now, and organizations are being forced to adapt to new challenges, and they're really looking for ways on how to rethink how business is done. I'm fortunate enough to work within an area of IBM where we can help our clients address some of those big challenges. Specifically, we provide support solutions for multi-vendor software products, and this also includes focusing on open source technologies, so providing support solutions for commercial as well as community open source software. Now, about 6 months ago, we actually commissioned a study with Forrester Consulting because we wanted to examine in depth how our clients were using open source software across their enterprises. And one area that we focused on specifically was really around the challenges that organizations face when they're not only building with, but also deploying and maintaining solutions built on open technologies. So what we wanted to do was identify, some of those key adoption challenges and some of those inhibitors that organizations face when deploying, open source at scale. So in my opinion, if we were to rerun that study today, I do think that we would see the biggest challenges, the same ones popping up, but I do feel that they would be viewed through a slightly different lens. And that's just what I wanted to talk a little bit about today. Enterprises are now trying to figure out how they move their businesses forward while adjusting to a lot of different things. So whether that's, a remote workforce, whether it's new ways of, selling and delivering services and products, or of course, additional cost pressures that we often see. So a couple of the ones that have changed slightly, again, in my opinion, are the ones that I've got listed here. So first, let's talk a little bit about governance. Now, in my experience, if you ask 10 different people what governance means, you're going to get 10 different answers because it's a very broad topic. But when I talk about governance, it really refers to kind of the people and processes that are used to create a management system around technology usage. And we're finding that this is actually a really hot topic right now. Obviously, it's because we're using, we see customers using more and more open technologies for mission critical IT, but they're also looking for help with a much broader set of services. And I would actually argue that all the challenges that you see listed here on the page, they're actually all elements of a good governance solution. One that's still hot, top of mind for customers is complex software stacks. As we continue to see the acceleration of digital transformation initiatives, it's not uncommon for, our customers to be using 5, 10, or even a lot more different packages when they're creating individual solutions. And what this challenge is, it's really about making sure that, all of those different packages, they all work together in harmony and they stay that way when something in the environment changes. Another one that's top of mind right now is really around choice. It's having too much choice. So initially, this was about selecting the right technologies. So what were the technologies that were best suited to achieve your business objectives? But this has actually taken on a whole new context, because what we're seeing now is that enterprises are really trying to determine if this is an area of cost optimization. And we get lots of questions around that. And the other one I'd like to talk about is really just enterprise support. Another trend that we continue to see is that organizations are leveraging more and more community open source in production. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. But one of the biggest challenges they face when they do this is around support. So it's the lack of enterprise quality support for these products. And that's really where my team comes in. So look, my organization, we work with our customers to build comprehensive support solutions for the open ecosystem. Our goal is to help address and build solutions for all of the challenges that I've just discussed. Now, a lot of people know us and are familiar with the fact that we've been providing support on the Linux operating system and a lot of commercial open source products, in excess of 2 decades, but they're not familiar with our broader portfolio of services, which includes actually our community open source support offering. And this is where we have the ability to provide that enterprise class support on over 150 different versions of community open source products. Now, the other thing is around our advisory services. So that's where we provide assistance to clients around things like interoperability guidance, installation, configuration, really just different services to help address some of these challenges that I just talked about today. So look, if you're part of a development team or you're a business leader and you're facing some of those challenges that I've covered, I would love to talk to you. So please, after our session today, come on by the IBM Digital booth. I'll be there along with some of my team to answer some questions. So when you get there, just click on the open source support link and I'd love to hear from you. With that, I'll turn it back over to Todd. Thanks.
To summarize, you've seen quite a bit today. We've also been able to give a very deserving community a hand up with some funds and some resources to help them. We thank the Pioneeras Dev organization for all the good work that they're doing in Colombia. And I ask that if you feel inclined, please join one of these projects or join the Trusted AI Committee and help us shape where things go. These are important times, and this is a topic that is going to help us as a world organization of open source contributors help move the world forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Todd and Camilla. That was a great talk. Our next speaker is Kohsuke Kawaguchi. He is the creator of Jenkins and co-CEO and founder of Launchable. Prior to Launchable, Kohsuke served as CTO of Cloud.gov, and today he's going to talk about the symbiotic relationship between Jenkins and Cloud.gov, sharing his lessons learned and how to build business value around a viable open source project. Please welcome Kohsuke Kawaguchi.
Hi, I'm Kohsuke. I created this open source project called Jenkins about 15 years ago. And then for the last 10 years or so, until very recently, I've been involved in Cloud.gov, where I was a key part of building a business around this open source project. And in that process, I learned a lot. So today I wanted to talk about that lessons on my experience on building a business around viable open source project. So yeah, I guess I already talked a little bit about myself. I started as an open source developer, and then became a CTO of this company, and spent a good bit of time trying to bridge this relationship between a company and open source project. So much of what I talk about today kind of came from that experience, things that got me thinking. So for the context of this conversation, it's not overly important what Cloud.gov does or what Jenkins is as an open source project. So suffice to say, if you think of the Cloud.gov to Jenkins as what the Red Hat does to Linux, then hopefully you can understand most of what I'm going to talk today. And that is, the flip side of it is, I think the lessons that I learned, I think is pretty universal to any open source project and any company is trying to lead it. So the first thing I think that made an impact for this project because of its beginning was this notion of, who owns the project? And usually this is not the first questions that the founder of the open source project would think about, because it doesn't really, it feels like it doesn't really matter. This feels like a subtle problems. And that is correct, but when it matters, it actually matters a lot, and it makes a huge difference. So this is something I think it's worth thinking about. So in case of Jenkins, what happened was that I used to work for a company, and at some point they wanted to exercise a control over the project. So the way they chose to do it is by claiming the trademark to the name of the project. And then they told the developers that if they want to continue doing something, they better accept the control by the company. So this naturally, obviously, pissed off the open source developers royally. So that's how the new name was adopted in Jenkins, and that's how the project was born. So because of that origin story, I'm very happy to say Jenkins is a community-owned project. So that is why this project joined the Linux Foundation, so that we have a neutral place where the project name means project is governed by. Because I think one of the things, that lessons that fiasco in the beginning that I just talked about taught me is that the open source projects that is owned by one company is fundamentally risky. Even if the current owner is well-behaving, benevolent, owner, the steward of the project, it is still just one wrong acquisition away from a disaster. And then that was exactly what happened to my previous employer. So, in order for other companies, other participants to feel the ownership stake into this project and feeling comfortable, putting their precious engineers' time to this project, I came to believe it's so much better to utilize the foundations like Next Foundations or Apache or Eclipse or really anything to do in that regard. And I think they drive the participation in ways that otherwise impossible. But so I'm very proud of this setup. But at the same time, for business, it does create challenges because your salespeople and marketing people can get so much value out of more straightforward association between the company and the project when they are one and the same. So I think a good example of that might be like a Docker, right? The Docker, the company, and Docker, the project, one and the same. Right? There's no need to explain those two things and their relationship. I can't say the same thing with Cloud and Jenkins. So this is something that leadership of the company needs to be able to understand and articulate and defend. And then there'll be always the constant questions of why this setup is chosen. Another sort of a key question for me in the Cloud was how to balance out the open source investment against the company interest. Engineering resources are always precious, regardless of the size of the company. So there's always this tension between how much of that should be spent on pushing open source forward versus pushing the company forward. So I think for too long, I feel like I failed to frame that into the right term. So from one side, one set of people are arguing for more investment in open source. From the other side, some other set of people are arguing for more investment in the product. And it kind of became a nasty tug of war. And in the end, whoever who controls the resources would win. So that's a little bit like this tension between devs and ops, and then how the DevOps movement kind of came into being. So I'm extra ashamed, on one hand, I was pitching for that kind of message, but on the other side, I failed to see the parallel between those two stories. So I think in looking back, I wish I spent more time figuring out what is the right metrics that guides us the right level of investment between open source and the proprietary product side. How do we what are the lines in which we connect the open source projects, thriving, viable open source project to the overall success and health of the business? Because I think every reasonable company leadership would understand that the right investment level is not zero. But the line between the effort that's spent on open source and how it contributes to the company needs to be drawn, even if the metrics might feel a little bit bullshit. Even in that, I think there's still a value in having some guideline, the baseline that other people agree on, so that you don't have to turn every fight into the tug of war. So that coming up is that metrics is something I feel I underinvested, and I still don't have a right answer. But I think if I get to do the next round, I think I know how to do this a little better. So anyway, on to how to make business out of open source projects. So the first thing the young Cloud as a company did was to build a hosted service of this open source project. So the hosted service was great. Well, one, because you you don't need to keep any changes you make proprietary. In fact, it's so much easier if you can push them all upstream. So in the early days, when we really don't have that many engineers working on it, the fact that our engineers can both push their services forward and also the open source project forward at the same time from one commit has been incredibly useful to make us look bigger than we actually were. And hosting also very nicely complements the key pain of open source, which is the overhead and time and the effort it takes to keep the software running. So those were great. But unfortunately, Jenkins was not designed with this kind of high density multi-tenancy hosting in mind. And these are the things that's very difficult to insert from after the fact. So in the long run, we couldn't make economics work well enough. So this business sort of faded away. But nonetheless, it provided this great fourth stage of the rocket that allows us to take on the next way of adding value, which is the enterprise version. So enterprise version was great for all sorts of reasons. Right? It allows us to create a bigger value. It allows the company to build up more IP, and then sell that to multiple people and charge the full price for each one of those. Unlike hosting, where every value you sell, it comes with a high cost of goods sold. So that was great, but it also not great in the sense that it created a bandwidth challenge. So this was around the time when this tug of war was the most difficult, because your engineer is either working on the open source project or they're working on the product, because they're completely different code base. And then when they work on the products, they from the perspective of open source, it's as good as it's indistinguishable from them disappearing. So you end up needing to chase those two different bars, and that's painful and challenge. And there's also another more subtle challenge that I'm going to try to explain here. So if you think about a space of value that the open source could provide or the solve, right? So naturally there's this organic growth, right? This circle represents the problem that open source already solved. And then what's happening is around the edges and the peripherals, people are constantly pushing that envelope out, and it tends to kind of grow over time, slowly but steadily. What the enterprise version does, in essence, is it takes a neighboring space of problem and value and then solve that in a separate circle, right? So where this gets a problem is imagine some of your engineers in your company working on the open source project, they are incentivized to not to grow open source into the directions toward the enterprise version. That's what this arrow is trying to represent. You don't want the open source project to solve the same problem that the enterprise version is solving, because that's where you make money, right? So if not managed carefully, what this ends up doing is it could interfere with the natural organic way of open source growing. And you can end up creating this situation when somebody who doesn't have that bias, when they look at it, they might feel like there's this obvious growing big pain that every key contributor to the project seems to be oblivious to. Right? And of course, what's happening is that it's not that they're oblivious to this problem. They just don't want to solve that in open source because they feel like that's the value that the enterprise version was supposed to provide. So if but what I guess what I'm trying to say is, in the eyes of outsiders, they don't appreciate those internal motivation why the project doesn't solve this, doesn't solve this pain, doesn't solve these challenges, why it has this giant pain. So they might simply choose to go elsewhere, and that in the long run can cast a shadow in the viability of the open source project, and that is not good. So anyway, the third thing that the company, this club, is taking on is the support. And this was also great if you can get there. And I say that because in the early days of a small company, let's say if you have just a few engineers, you can't provide the support in a straight face. You need to achieve a sufficient scale and credibility as a business before companies would come to you and ask you to take their money to provide them the support. So once you get there, though, it's really great because your customers will drive you to improve open source. They're coming to you to solve the pain they have in open source, and they actually much prefer if the way you solve it is also a part of the open source as opposed to in something else. So that's great. It's it was the same situation with the hosting stations, except what you need to be careful is the people who buy support from you are actually a small subset of small uneven subset of your audience. So if you end up spending too much time to solve their problems and neglect the other larger number of smaller ordinary voiceless users, then you might end up creating this kind of skew to in the open source project again as well. So for example, you might cater to more complex use cases, more flexibility, etc. And then you might not value the ease of use or ease of installation or somebody who is only using it casually. Right? And then that can be a problem. And it also, support fundamentally relies on the fact that your product is somewhat painful to use. And that's not really a healthy, long-term tenable situations, because the same frustrations that led your users to become your customers can also push them to your competing solutions. And you not only lose the revenue, but you might also lose the user. So I think in some sense, this sort of underscores the importance of figuring out the right level of investment in the open source, almost oblivious, and then kind of give them enough free hand so that they can solve the problems they see in the open source period. But with all that said, I really think the support is a great way to add value. Like, it really adds value. It makes your open source project far more credible in the eyes of the users, for example. And support is so much more than just answering questions. And that's something I learned over the time at Cloudbees. So highly recommend it. Anyway, so the last phase, I think, of this business to open source relationship is that the business chooses to move upstack. Right? So in the process of getting to know your customers and users so well, and your company getting bigger, you can now tackle on the bigger challenges that the customers are facing. That includes the open source as a part of it, but it's not the whole thing. And I feel like that's certainly what happened to the Cloudbees when we tackled software delivery management, which is to say how the organization tackles the effective software delivery, which naturally includes CI/CD as a part of it, but that's not the entirety. So finally, like we could, some of these like dilemmas and conflicts that I talked about earlier are no longer the problem for us. So I'm short on time, so let me quickly talk about some of the other lessons I learned in the course of Cloudbees and Jenkins. And one is that, as an ambassador from the company making money in and around open source projects, you don't need to be apologetic about the fact that your participation into this open source project is bringing revenue to your company, and you obviously don't want to be condescending either. But for example, like you need to help other people in the community see the value that your company brings to the community, including, for example, the credibility that it brings to the project, which I just mentioned about, or the fact that the company can put other job functions like design, marketing, event, and so on and so forth to the project. And that does not happen in the organic, pure developer community, right? Or like a company can put together organized team of engineers to take on a big effort, which is traditionally it's difficult for a bunch of volunteers to coordinate. Also, early on, when the company was small, we only had people who knew how to roll in open source projects. So, it was easy. But as the company got bigger and we wanted to put other job function people than developers, it's kind of important to help them understand how to be effective in open source projects. Like there's this tendency to, what you don't want to be is like you come across as a faceless group of people and then like hiding behind the banner of the company. Like, we all know that what makes the open source project tick is a human relationship, a personal relationship between participants. And that's something I think important for your company people to understand. Like they need to be able to engage with the other participants of the project on their own. And there it's okay for them to have their own opinions. It also means I think the project needs to evolve to accept the fact that there are other participants, people not writing source code, and they are actually an important part of the community. So educating that, I think, is also important. And the hiring people from the community has also been an interesting question and challenges. So it was great that you can bring in qualified people from day one, but it also creates, by which I mean like a higher contributors of the community into your company. But it also tends to create a monoculture because they are kind of all the fact that they are being a long-time contributor. They tend to, it tends to bring like-minded folks, and then so that creates a certain blind spots. Like it kind of creates a group think, and that makes it difficult for that group to address the pain that other people from other backgrounds would see. So I kind of fundamentally believe in this diversity, and I don't just mean like like a race or the gender, but really like a different background, different perceptions, and different values they place on the technology. And those, I think the conversation and exchanging of ideas among these people are actually pretty critical to create a thriving open source project. So, and then another part is like, as you get bigger and you keep hiring from the community, you naturally like and then some of these people you put on to work on other things than open source, you start to deplete the pool of contributors from the project, and that's not great. These people can be, yeah, anyway, so that I can talk a lot about this point, but in the interest of time, let's move on. So the last bit is that it's sort of important to always have some level of creative destructions. I think in a viable open source project, this naturally happens, or else it wouldn't have survived. But the company, I think, tends to coordinate its act together far more than a bunch of volunteer open source developers are willing to do. So they tend to, not to want to run these experiments or like wild shot, and then etc. Now, and that coordination is great because that's what makes the organization effective. But if you think about it, if you have to convince everyone about something that you want to do, then you only get to really do incremental improvements. And then that's great, that's okay for a while, but in the long run, that just alone is going to kill innovations. So if everything needs to be aligned, then also like none of these efforts can fail because it's so interdependent on each other. And if you cannot take on projects that might fail, then again, you're not going to have innovations. So I sort of like one thing I learned is it's important to have a little bit of slack, like a little bit of willingness to say, well, this may or may not work out, and then be able to take that on and be able to kill them if you discover that it is not working out. So to wrap that up, in the end, I kind of feel like I've been telling a whole lot of why this is a challenge. So I want to end my talk on a high note. Despite all the challenges, I still very much believe in open source because open source is in the world. Like it's just hands down better way of developing software. It creates more flexible software. It creates more higher quality software. It evolves faster. And I'm preaching this to the room full of believers. So, but I really think it's true. Like it helps us tap into diverse set of talents from around the world, coming from a different perspective and different parts of the tech stack. And collectively, I think even though we are not perfect, I think it just tends to create a far better software than a group of engineers working for the same company coming from a similar origin. And I just fundamentally love this idea, from anywhere from the world, we can work together. And this just does not happen in so many other model collaborations. So I think the open source business complements this effort, and it helps the world have more open source. So that, I think, makes this endeavor worthwhile. And then on that note, I wanted to end my talk. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. It's so exciting to be here. And I thought I would start off by telling you the backstory of how I became an advocate for inclusive workplaces. And this is actually my second career. In my first career, I spent about 25 years working in tech, building software products. I started out as a software engineer writing code for a living, and over time I moved into leadership roles. And most recently, I was a vice president of engineering at Adobe. And during that 25 years, I noticed a decline happening, a decline in gender diversity. And so while I was still at Adobe, I started being a very vocal advocate for women at the company. I started our women's employee resource group. I started mentoring a lot of women and basically looking out for women across the company. I loved doing that work so much that about 7-8 years ago now, I started my own business as a leadership coach for women working in tech. And that business, I love doing that work. It's very fulfilling. I think I help my clients. But I have to tell you, all of them are working in environments and companies where basically the closer you get to the C-suite, the CEO, the maler and paler it gets. And well, with all due respect to anyone who's male or pale listening to me today, it's just the demographics. It's what it looks like in tech. And so I started paying attention to how people could be more inclusive at work. And not just for women, but for people of color, for Black people, for people of different religious backgrounds, gender, sexual orientations and identities, ages, abilities, I started looking at what could we do to make all of tech more inclusive. I kind of wanted to change the world. And of course, these days, what's the first thing anyone does when they want to change the world? Well, either you make a hashtag or a Twitter handle. And so about 5 years ago, I started the Twitter handle @BetterAllies. And this Twitter handle, my goal was to share simple, everyday actions people could take to be more inclusive at work. Things like, I'm going to notice when an interruption happens in a meeting and redirect the conversation back to the person who was interrupted. I would share things such as, well, I'm going to ask at the next Engineering All Hands what we are doing about pay inequity and ask if we can, raise awareness of what pay inequity is and do something about it. These are just simple everyday actions I would tweet. Now, over time, I started getting speaking engagements, and I started speaking about this approach, this Better Allies approach of simple everyday actions. And inevitably, during the Q&A, someone would ask, hey, Karen, do you have a book? And for many years, I kept saying, no, I don't have a book. And they're like, well, we'd like more of this. We want more of these everyday actions. This seems so approachable and so smart, so actionable. And so I eventually wrote my books. I didn't just write one, I wrote two. The first book is Better Allies, Everyday Actions to Create Inclusive Workplaces. And I followed it up with the Better Allies Approach to Hiring. And I think this topic is actually more important than ever before. Because in the wake of George Floyd's murder and countless others, people around the world, and definitely here in the United States, are not satisfied with the status quo. They do not want the racial inequity to continue that we've been seeing in our country, workplaces, and so forth. So people are protesting. People are donating money. People are electing new officials and demanding policy change. And I hope that for all of you here today, that in addition to anything else you're doing, that you will also be looking for how you can disrupt the status quo in your workplaces to be more inclusive of people from, definitely be more inclusive of Black people and people from other underrepresented groups. And I firmly believe that this whole job of inclusion, you don't have to have it on your business card. You don't have to be your chief diversity and inclusion and belonging officer to make a difference. There are things all of us can be doing every day in our workplaces and in our open source communities to be more inclusive. And so what does this look like? Well, first up, you need to get to know people who are different from you, from different backgrounds and different gender orientations and so forth. You need to get to know people. And unfortunately, most of us have these just like me networks. These networks full of people who are similar to us because we like hanging out with them. We have things in common with them, whether that is going to a sporting event like these guys here on the slide or something else. We have something in common. We like hanging out with them, and we tend to be drawn to people who are like us. Now, I want all of you to reflect for a minute about your own professional network. Would you say it is very diverse, somewhat diverse, or you could do better? I bet as you reflect on your own network, most of us would probably vote on number 2 or 3 here. Like, we have some work to do. They're not super diverse. And I want you to think, especially if you are white listening to me, I want you to think about what the experience might be for example, just one demographic, a Black woman. A Black woman in your workplace or community, what's her experience like? And I'm going to share some survey results where Black women surveyed said their manager has met one-on-one with other people on their team, but not with them. Another survey found that Black women And I apologize, that's supposed to say 60%. Almost 60% report that they've never had an informal interaction with a senior leader. More than half of Black women have never had a senior leader do things and say things like, well, how was your weekend? Maybe in the coffee room or the break room or in the elevator into the office. They've never had a senior leader reach out to them in a virtual chat saying, hey, nice to see you here, right? Those are what informal interactions are like, and those lead to feeling belonging and inclusion in the workplace. And I'll also say what happens outside of work. Outside of work, there's social science research showing that men tend to hang out with other male coworkers, whether that's on the golf course or a virtual poker game or something else. But men tend to hang out with male coworkers, and that deepens and strengthens their professional network, even though they're outside the office. Women, by contrast, we tend to hang out with people in our community, people, whether we perhaps we're in a book club or we are volunteering at a nonprofit, or if we have young children, we're hanging out with parents at their school, perhaps it's a religious organization we belong to. So we women are broadening our network, but not strengthening the deep professional ties like the men. And over time, that really adds up. It adds up in terms of this inequity, in terms of how powerful a network can be. And these just like me networks really limit diversity. Let's face it, as we think about who we hire, we look to our networks, we trust those people. We want to hire them and recommend them. We know they can do the job. So if we have homogeneous networks, we will hire homogeneity. And these just like me networks also impact who we trust at work or in our communities. As we think about stretch assignments, new leadership positions, promotions, maybe if we're doing a reorganization or doing some succession planning as a leader, we know and trust the people we've been hanging out with, we've been spending time with, and those are the people we're going to put forth for these new opportunities. So I want to share 4 everyday actions all of you can take to diversify your network. And the first is get to know colleagues who don't look like you. Sounds so obvious, but the next time you're at a live event, go over and say hello to someone during a networking opportunity. Perhaps it is doing something more virtually as well, but get to know them, introduce yourself, start a conversation. I also recommend you join Slack channels or other forums for underrepresented groups. Many of them exist, and all you have to do is ask permission if you, as not a member of that demographic, can join, so that you can listen and learn about the conversation and get to know people. You can also attend events for people from different underrepresented groups. For example, I am a white woman. I've recently been to some Black in Tech events, which have been incredibly insightful, powerful, and I've gotten to know new people. I am straight. I could attend a Lesbians Who Tech event, again, to get to know folks, understand the conversations, understand some of the discussions they're having. These events are out there. They're easy to attend virtually. And if you're not sure you'd be welcome, again, just ask the organizers or check the website. They're often open to allies. And last but not least, look to volunteer with nonprofits who are serving these marginalized communities. Nonprofits such as maybe there is a robotics program at a local high school that you could volunteer with, or be a mentor virtually for a coding boot camp that serves one of these communities. These are just some ideas of how you can diversify your network, but that really is the first step in being a better ally and creating a more inclusive environment. So once you have diversified your network, you can get started with the next step, which is to sponsor people. What does sponsorship look like? Maybe you have formal programs at your company. That's great. But you can also look to sponsor in smaller ways without having it be a formal network, formal program. Here are 5 things you can think about doing to sponsor people from underrepresented groups, coworkers, colleagues, members of open source communities that you belong to. The first is recommend them for stretch assignments and speaking opportunities. These things are like these rocket fuel for one's career. They help someone gain visibility, they open doors, they help someone build credibility with a group. So as you think about the next time you have to recommend someone for a speaking opportunity, it could just be at your engineering all hands or at a big conference. Think about who just normally comes to mind. And if that is not someone from an underrepresented group, maybe take a step back, reflect on your network, think about someone else that you could recommend. And if no one comes to mind from an underrepresented group, well, maybe you need to go back to the first step and diversify your network more so that you do know these people. They're out there, they're talented, they're skilled, they can do the job. Second thing is endorse them publicly. I was on the receiving end of one of these endorsements, and it felt so good. I mentioned I used to work at Adobe, and when I first joined the company, I remember being in a large engineering leadership meeting, and I heard my boss, who was a very respected, longtime employee, and senior vice president of engineering, I heard my boss say, well, what I learned from Karen is the following. And he went on to say something. Those few words of what I learned from Karen were a game changer for me. They elevated my standing with my new peers. This very respected person learned something from me. He gave me credibility in the moment, which was long lasting. And as I said, it felt really good. So that's one example of how you can endorse someone publicly, is share something you learned from them. There are other ways to do this too. Think about how you endorse people publicly. Again, and think about upping your game and doing it even more for people from underrepresented groups. Third thing, share their career goals with influencers, with decision makers. As you get to know people from underrepresented groups, do you know what they want to be doing? Do they want to move ahead on their career ladder? Do they want to work in some new technology space? Do they want to get involved in, if it's an open source community, with one of your leadership roles down the road? Find out what they want to be doing, and then look for opportunities to connect the dots for them to these opportunities. Fourth, invite them to high-profile meetings. Now, you may be thinking, oh my gosh, I had so many meetings already. Who would want to go to another meeting? But these high-profile meetings can be game changers for people who aren't normally invited. High-profile meetings such as, a customer advisory meeting, or some strategic planning meeting where you're planning the future. Or it could just be, virtual drinks with some newly hired, VIP at your company or in your organization. Look to invite people from these groups who normally don't have access, so they can start expanding their network with those people, but also have insight into the conversations that are happening in the room. And if you feel like you need permission before you invite someone, go ahead and get the permission. That's fine. If you don't ask, it's not going to happen. And fifth, last but not least, I encourage you to speak their name when they're not around. What do I mean by this? Well, I was watching a TED Talk by Carla Harris, and Carla Harris is a senior vice chairman at Morgan Stanley. And she gave a TED Talk in 2018 where she talked about meritocracy, or the lack thereof, actually. She talked and debunked the myth that all you have to do to get ahead is to do good work, and that people will notice and you'll advance. She debunked that myth and instead pointed out how powerful and how important it is to have someone who is in those calibration meetings, in those promotion meetings, someone who is speaking your name and who knows you well enough to talk about your accomplishments and your potential. So this is a powerful way to sponsor someone, is get to know them enough so that you can speak their name and advocate for them in the meetings you're attending. All right, so a quick note for my open source friends out there. There is language that we use in tech that is not inclusive. And here are just two examples. Let's use a blacklist to deny access to our trial product or our service. Or the master-slave architecture that we've configured for our servers, our database, or whatever, these are not very inclusive at all. And I encourage all of you to think about changing your open source code to be more inclusive. A simple, instead of blacklist, it could be a block list. That's what you're doing. You're blocking access. Instead of master-slave, something like primary replica, for example. Maybe you don't like that exact phrasing. That's fine. Choose something that you think is appropriate for your technology. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up now. And I hope that through my talk today, you also feel and want to join me on this journey of like inclusion being a job for everyone, not just for people who have diversity, inclusion, and belonging on their business card. There's something we all can do. And if you'd like to learn more about this, I have my books. I would encourage you to read Better Allies. I also have a newsletter that I send out every Friday. It's called 5 Ally Actions, where I kind of do a roundup of what I've seen during the week and provide these tangible, everyday actions people can take. And you can also follow me on social media at Better Allies. And a final note, I will head over to the Slack channel called 2-track-diversity-inclusion. I'll head over there for about the next 15 or 20 minutes and answer any questions and continue the conversation there. Thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Jim.
Thank you, Karen. That was a wonderful talk. And I loved your book. Particularly the chapter on everyday language. I have to admit, I have been trying to eradicate the term guys from my language, which just almost became a verbal tick, but you have some pointers in your book, and I am going to keep working on that. So I really appreciate the work you're doing, and your book really is an inspiration. People should go out and get that book. You also mentioned about eradicating racially charged language in code. Coincidentally, our next speaker published a blog yesterday on making open source more inclusive by eradicating problematic language. Chris Wright from Red Hat is suggesting we do that. And you'll be seeing some news from Priyanka Sharma, who is the head of our Cloud Native Computing Foundation. She's going to be leading an initiative from the Linux Foundation to help coordinate eradicating that very language. So thank you for the inspiration this morning, and loved your book. Again, folks, please go out and get Karen's book. It's full of wonderful advice on how to become an ally. So next, we're going to hear from Chris Wright, Senior Vice President and CTO at Red Hat. Please welcome Chris.
Open source code runs our largest companies, our governments, the infrastructure of the internet. It powers scientific discovery and space travel. Building software using the open source development process creates real business value, sure, but not all the world's problems are business related. In fact, some of the biggest issues we face can't be solved by business alone. Sometimes we're so excited about what's possible that we forget about social responsibility and the repercussions of our actions. Like racially problematic language that filters into open source code and IT terminology. Like the implicit bias within AI models, or the need to secure personal privacy from surveillance, or the global issues such as our carbon footprint and climate change, or responding to a global pandemic like COVID-19. These are all examples where communities can gather and make a difference. In fact, in response to the current pandemic, Red Hatters really wanted to help. So we identified a few specific projects and are encouraging Red Hatters to work together in these projects to pitch in and help. OpenEMR, an open source electronic medical record system used by health providers for scheduling, tracking, and treating patients. COVIDNet, an open source neural network used to detect COVID-19 from chest x-rays. And Connected Health IDaaS, bringing Camel, Drools, Kafka, and Kubeflow together into an intelligent data-as-a-service platform that enables healthcare providers to make informed decisions. And acknowledging this virtual event, I'd be remiss not to highlight that we can all do our part to fight COVID-19 by practicing social distancing and wearing a mask in public. We're in this together, each and every one of us. Open source communities like these are one way we can facilitate global collaboration in order to create impact right now, a way any of us can contribute. We cannot overcome challenges like these without continued broad cooperation across organizations and societies at all levels, from technology to policy to individual actions. And it's worth noting that technological solutions created in isolation from the parties they may affect will typically fall short. All right, so let me bring this back to open source and IT. Open source software development is about opening access and removing the barrier between IP owners and users. It enables engagement between developers and users and empowers communities with freedom, with flexibility and choice. There's creative value in the virtuous cycle of user-driven innovation. Collaboration to solve big challenges is not at all new. Collaboration drove our industrial revolutions by agreeing to uniform standards of size and measurement for industrial spanning railroads and international communication channels. Or take the scientific method, for example. We eradicated diseases like smallpox by enabling the scientific community to work together across international boundaries. Open access is crucial when building the software and infrastructure that will help solve today's problems. The world needs IT infrastructure that does not constrain cooperation in order to maximize business value. We must ensure innovators can focus on creating solutions and worry less about whether supporting technologies allow their experimentation. This flexibility and choice is why Red Hat is focused on the open hybrid cloud. We're building a platform for this essential collaboration. Now, we want our portfolio to be successful, obviously, but also responsible. And at the same time, we want to continue our work supporting innovation across the digital landscape. Even if we don't see the value of that innovation immediately or directly, it matters to someone somewhere as they scratched that itch. And someday we may find it matters to us too, in ways we couldn't imagine because our eyes were focused on a different goal. After all, your memory foam mattress wouldn't exist if NASA didn't need to make pilots comfortable on long flights. So when it comes to IT operations, we can apply that same approach, building a place for information to be shared, building the railroad to connect the community, sharing the formula that makes up your mattress. Because the history of operations isn't like that of railroads or communication standards or medical and scientific practice, it's not all connected. It's not a community. It's operational knowledge in silos, divided by industry, by individual business practices, even among teams in the same organization. And as open source communities have redefined how software is developed and features are delivered, we must advance and consider how communities deliver operational excellence along with open source software. Operate First is how we address these divisions and how we'll build an operations community. Operate First is our effort to encapsulate operational excellence within our platform in order to enable creativity across our broad partner ecosystem. Operate First is about making operational considerations as much a part of what we do as upstream first is for code. Making operations first our guiding principle in the development of our cloud computing platforms, we're doing what we've always done. We're connecting with our communities and using the foundations and principles of open source to meet the challenges of today. In this way, we continue to try to make room for all the voices and all the innovation, even the ones we're blind to today. And we ensure that open source can continue to unlock the world's potential. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Our next speaker is Megan Byrd-Sanicki. She's a manager of research and operations in the Google Open Source Program Office, where she champions open source citizenship within Google and the industry at large. Today, she'll share a few words on citizenship during COVID. Welcome, Megan.
Thank you. That's what Google wants to say today. COVID has impacted open source in all industries, and we are so grateful to work with so many of you to make sure open source stays sustainable during this really challenging time. Of course, Google has been committed to open source citizenship way before COVID, and that's because we use over 2,000 projects and contribute to them as well. We need to make sure these projects remain future-proofed, and we do this with three main sustainability efforts. First, we contribute talent, whether it's code or tech writers, design, you name it. Plus, we contribute funds directly to projects, and we create sustainability programs that we use and also share broadly with the industry. And we hope you'll check these out, such as OSS Fuzz, which uncovers security vulnerabilities, and it's used today by 250 projects and has already filed 16,000 bugs and 30,000 vulnerabilities. We also have Google Summer of Code, which is a 15-year-long program that has brought 15,000 students to over 680 projects, and together they have contributed over 36 million lines of code to open source. Plus, we have our newest program, Season of Docs, that brings tech writers into projects. And so far, they've helped improve the documentation for 44 projects. And I hope you'll check these out. We really do want to share these resources with everyone in the industry, especially during this time of COVID. And that's because so many challenges popped up seemingly overnight. First, there were financial challenges as events were canceled or we had to move to virtual events. Plus, there were talent shortages as people had to find new jobs and didn't have time to contribute. Or they were finding themselves at home, providing care for people they love and working at the same time. And of course, we had to all figure out how to take our communities fully online and understand how to make that work, such as meetups or conferences like this. It hasn't been easy, and there's been some pain that came with these challenges. But what's really inspired me is how well individuals and organizations came together and started to solve this, and they started solving it quickly. And I am so proud of the ways that Google was able to step up and help with everyone else. We started to reach out to projects that we use to find out what they're experiencing and seeing how we can help them. And it's helped us form stronger relationships that we can build off of now into the future. Plus, we pivoted our internship program. You just can't have students go into your offices. And so we decided to bring them into open source. And so now 1,000 interns are going to work with Googlers who are going to mentor them so they contribute well and they do it right. Plus, many Googlers have been contributing to open source on the front lines with projects like NextStrain or COVID Act Now and schema.org. And we also shared with everyone an online community guide. And it's to help you learn how to quickly pivot and have your online events. And it comes from all of the tips and tricks that we've learned over the years providing this here at Google. I'm really honored that we can help in these ways. But mostly, I'm just so grateful that we can work together to make sure open source remains sustainable, because it can only be sustainable if we work together. So you can count on Google to continue its commitment to citizenship now and beyond COVID. And if you would like to contribute as well, there's some simple ways to do so. And you don't need to be a large enterprise to make a difference. You can go into your project and see which issues you can answer today. You can also look for some languishing pull requests and close them out. And you can do a small donation to a project. It can really make a difference. You might buy some swag, or maybe you just do a small membership fee. And again, we really would like to share our open source resources with you and all of our sustainability programs. So please check them out at opensource.google. And lastly, we want to hear new ideas of how we can help open source. So please share your ideas. Use today's platform and let us know what we can be doing. We're going to be listening. So thank you so much for your time, and especially thank you for contributing to open source.
Thank you very much, Megan. We hope to see more. Our next speaker is Eddie Tejeda. He is the director of Cloud.gov in the General Services Administration of the U.S. government. Created by industry experts, Cloud.gov is a response to large-scale technology failures. like the initial launch of healthcare.gov. Today, Eddie will highlight the impacts of open source software and working in the open to bring high scalability, high security, and highly compliant solutions to one of the most regulated environments in the world. Welcome, Eddie.
Hi, my name is Eddie Tejeda, and I'm the director of Cloud.gov. We're housed within another office called the Technology Transformation Service within GSA in the federal government. So my goal in this presentation is to make the case that PaaS should be default in government. I think some of the experiences that I have will show you why I think this might be the case, and hopefully you find it a valuable perspective as well. But first, I want to give you a brief overview of Cloud.gov. Cloud.gov's mission is to make it easy for government to access cloud services. It's pretty straightforward. We were created by another office within the GSA called 18F. And this is a digital consulting office that works across the federal government to help improve the user experience of government services by helping them build and buy technology. We've had some great projects. I recommend you all check it out at 18f.gsa.gov. But some of the ones that you may have heard of are usaspending.gov, which tracks a lot of government spending data, and FBI Crime Explorer, which looks at crime data. One of the things that these early teams found themselves running into in these projects was that they ran into the same exact hurdles over and over again. First, provisioning resources, provisioning these cloud services could take weeks. And then the ATO process, which is the gold standard, the thing that allows you to move to production, it means authority to operate, that process could take months. And most of it is primarily because of documentation that you have to build before you launch to production. So instead of repeating this process over and over again, what the team did was implement a version of Cloud Foundry in-house, and they called it Cloud.gov. There's also this special sauce called FedRAMP, which is something that allows agencies to inherit the security and compliance from other cloud providers. So I'll get more into that. I'll talk more about that in a second, because I think that is going to be an important part of this. Since Cloud.gov launched, it's worked across the federal government at a lot of different agencies. So we've been able to have a pretty good view of the federal government. And everything we do is open source. You can go to Cloud.gov to learn more, or check out our repository on GitHub, where you can see all of our source code. Everything we do happens in the open. We love sharing our experiences and our lessons. So check it out. So this is what I was talking about. This is one of the index pages of a 400-page report that you have to create in order for you to launch to production for a moderate level system. And this has to be created for every application that you are going to launch to production, no matter what. Some might be shorter, might be only 200 pages if the impact is low, but it could be many more hundreds of pages if there are some serious security risks with launching. And what Cloud.gov is able to do is say, out of, say, 325 security controls that must be documented for you to move to production for a moderate system, we can handle 269 of those within Cloud.gov. So your documentation process is a lot simpler. You are responsible for 41 that we could work together on, and then 15 or so that you are responsible as somebody who is as the app developer. So just in this diagram, you can see what it is that Cloud.gov provides. And you've all probably seen this diagram showing how a platform as a service allows you to think and work higher on the stack and not have to worry about all the lower level components of your application. But this takes on a whole new meaning in the federal government, where it's not just about the technology that you're managing, it's also about the documentation and the ATO that you need to have in place before you move to production. So biggest benefits of Cloud.gov, you can move to production sooner. You can provide a consistent developer experience. So once you've worked in one agency, you can work on another agency's project with a similar toolkit. And small businesses love the platform because small businesses don't like to do a lot of this documentation. This is not where their value lies. In many ways, it's what excludes a lot of businesses from being able to participate and work with the federal government. So as the public cloud becomes much more sophisticated, it's becoming a lot more complex as well. And one thing that we know about complexity and choice is that it can be overwhelming. Now, this has been studied from a lot of different perspectives. In psychology, there's this idea of paradox of choice, about how people are less satisfied with individual choices that they make, the more choices that they have. In behavioral economics, that people are overwhelmed by choices and don't often make the best decisions for themselves, and we need to nudge them to make sure that they, for example, enroll in a retirement plan. And even in software development, we have seen the rise of convention over configuration, which, especially in the early 2000s, where there was a focus on having best practices baked into the platform as opposed to a lot of XML files, which we all had to edit. So this is where platform as a service comes back into the conversation. Kelsey Hightower, which I suspect most people here know, has been talking about this recently. He recently tweeted just a couple of weeks ago that there's a ton of effort attempting to modernize application at the infrastructure layer, but there isn't equal investment at the application layer, and thinks that frameworks and application servers, there needs to be a lot more focus on them. Otherwise, we're only solving half of the problem. And in government, we're already seeing increased interest in PaaS. We've had a number of folks reach out to us who said, we've built these complex tools, these complex systems, sort of our homegrown environments, but we are willing to give up control for simplicity. It's becoming too hard for us to manage. And right now, we're at a really interesting phase where orchestration tools like Kubernetes are everywhere. This is part of the shift and part of the power that has allowed people to access a lot of these different tools. But I think that that's not the whole picture. We need to start thinking also about the experience of developers. And this is where Cloud Foundry kicks in. We can start thinking more about Kubernetes and different components of the developer experience to be in the background. They don't have to be something that a developer is interacting with every day. And we can provide government employees and contractors a consistent developer experiences, while the back end, a lot of that technology in the back end can change. And this is massive in government. We can have automated security compliance requirements built in directly into the stack. Agencies will be able to attract new businesses who will be able to build on an existing infrastructure that they can trust and become familiar with. And we also can leave space for some projects that do need to squeeze out every last value out of the infrastructure. But in the future, if we're going to continue to invest in cloud, especially in the federal government where we're just getting started, we need to start thinking about the next generation of developers that are going to be maintaining these tools. We love sharing our experiences with agencies and other businesses. If you're interested in learning more, feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Thanks, Eddie. Our final speaker today is also going to touch on the effect of coronavirus and how it's impacted us all. Grace Francisco is Vice President of Worldwide Developer Relations and Education at MongoDB and has for over 2 decades been working as a leader in worldwide developer initiatives at companies such as Microsoft, Intuit, Yodlee, Atlassian, and Roblox. Today, she will talk about community and belonging in the time of coronavirus. Welcome, Grace.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you, wherever you may be dialed in for this event. My name is Grace Francisco. I'm the head of developer relations for MongoDB. And I've had the great privilege of being in developer relations for over 16 years across a variety of different companies, both large and small. I recently also joined the board of the Drupal Association, which was a great honor for me, having worked with the Drupal community well over a decade ago while I was still at Microsoft. It goes without saying that we are living under extraordinary times today. And while we've been sheltered in place for several months now here in my area, I've been thinking a lot about this book I read many, many years ago, Love in the Time of Cholera by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, for which I had the inspiration for the title of my own talk today. Cholera was actually a pandemic as well, and there were 7 incidences of cholera over the course of 150 plus years. And in this book, largely on the surface, it's about this romance between these two people over the course of 50 years, where in that 50-year time frame, they were separated by time, space, a marriage, cholera, and war. And while I've been thinking about this in developer relations during this pandemic, I think about the fact that I certainly hope that it doesn't take us 50 plus years for us to have meaningful connections again with developers as we do our work. And the other thing that comes to mind for me frequently as I get up is that I've woken up into some wacky episode of The Twilight Zone. And so very appropriately, the Washington Post had written this article about 7 specific episodes that seem so appropriate for this particular time. And interestingly, the pilot episode of The Twilight Zone itself, which was entitled, Where is Everybody?, is very appropriate for today. It opens up with this Air Force officer who wakes up not knowing who he is, where he is, and he wanders about this empty town looking for someone, anyone. And as his panic escalates, as he's not finding people but finding signs of life, he runs out into the open space, into the town square, screaming, "Where is everybody?" And he's been trying to wake himself up, saying, "It's time to wake up. It's time to wake up." And, this is very relevant to me right now as we live through this pandemic. And the virus has really significantly changed the way we internet. As many of us are seeking to connect virtually across social networks like Facebook, or to really forget about this experience for a brief moment by entertaining ourselves. And not surprisingly, we're not on the go right now, so mobile app usage has plummeted. And in this period where we've all been sheltered in place, many of us are seeking minute-by-minute updates on the news, and so news channels have gone up significantly in traffic. As we sit and ponder what's going on in the world, what the latest updates are about coronavirus, about what's going on with the riots and protests, and really thinking, where is everybody? Where is everybody? Is everybody okay? And I will tell you where everybody is right now. They're all here in Muppetland on Zoom, trying to connect on things like even Google Duo and House Party, these social networks that were really not being used much until recently during this pandemic. We're all striving to reconnect, to still have that social fabric. And yet, is this really how we want to connect? Well, no, it's more like this, being a little bit more personal with someone one-on-one, except that you try to do this over Zoom, and Kermie is actually looking off into some other part of the screen. And so his eyes aren't looking at you. He thinks he's looking at you, but he's not. And you have the same experience. So you actually miss the true connection. And it becomes exhausting to actually try to interrelate and to feel that connection when you're not actually having that face-to-face, eye-to-eye connection. And we are all overtaxing our home internet, as many of you know. And we are in these Zooms or whatever video platform that you're on, and we often hiccup our way through internet space, and we leave our meetings frozen like this as our internet hiccups and freezes us in time, and often have this expression like Han Solo being frozen in carbonite And this is the impression that we leave our colleagues as we drop out suddenly from that meeting. Well, I don't know about you guys, but that's exhausting. So sometimes I just have to take a break from that virtual space and be out in the real world. And so I go out on this walk to contemplate the meaning of life and how to belong in this world where we have to have social distancing. And I walk these deserted streets thinking about how to belong when you can't really be there in person. How do we belong and have meaning? And so I take these long walks and I contemplate. Then I get home with my furry pets who are absolutely exhausted with my multiple walks a day, contemplating the meaning of life and how to belong and how to relate in this virtual space of ours. And really, these poor pups are reflecting the absolute sheer exhaustion we're all facing right now in trying to make this work in this virtual format. Some of us have really been leaning into learning as we've been sheltered in place. And interestingly, these massive open online courses that were declining have seen 7 times the traffic during the pandemic than they have in previous periods. And so people are reskilling, learning new programming languages, new frameworks, new technology disciplines like data science in their time sheltered in place, which is great. Interestingly, though, the most popular course, the breakout hit during the pandemic, is really about the science of well-being. And not surprisingly, it's about well-being because we're all struggling to keep our sanity during this pandemic, this really crazy Twilight Zone era of ours that we're experiencing together. Evans Data published this report a while ago forecasting that by the end of 2019, we would have well over 24 million developers through the end of 2019. And these are global professional developers. I expect that this forecast is going to be changed quite a bit in the coming years in terms of the volume of growth given all this new learning and people really leaning into reskilling. And we are very fortunate in tech to have work that can be easily done from home. And so people are going to be looking to these kinds of workloads and jobs that can be done from home as this pandemic is going to be here for quite some time. And we're seeing massive shifts in the biggest developer conferences, either canceling or virtualizing or postponing in hopes for that in-person experience again. And now we get to this picture of fish. Why am I showing you pictures of fish? And this is the part where I'm a broken record with my developer relations team about the fact that we can't possibly meet 24 million developers all in person anyway. And this is a discussion we were having well before the pandemic hit. And so the team has been well positioned to really lean in more into their online component and workload because we're always talking about scaling. But the truth of it is, many of us really miss being on planes, traveling to that next destination to meet developers in person. Because honestly, nothing replaces this experience of being on the stage, being there, seeing all of you, speaking with all of you, feeling the energy and the vibe of the community. This we miss a ton. And in thinking about this and reflecting about this new virtualized format, I remember this question I had from an open source attendee at a conference I spoke at many years ago. And he came to me after my talk and he said, "Are you relating yet?" And I was completely perplexed and I thought, am I relating yet? Oh, he's referring to the fact that my title has developer relations in it. And so I asked this question to myself a lot right now. Am I relating yet? Are people relating yet? Because this virtualized format is so hard to do that. And to be honest, there's no silver bullet. There's no magic formula to this right now. We're all learning as we go. Because really, in this Muppet land that we're in right now, this is as close as we're going to get. So how do we belong when we are this far apart and this is as close as we're going to get for some time during this pandemic? Some of us are really leaning into our technical skills and using that for good by leaning into the things that are so important to us, like saving our oceans. And for some, they're really leaning in with their technical skills and creating net new solutions in the battle for COVID-19, such as this employee-driven initiative. Employees across MongoDB, Apple, Alphabet, and Amazon got together to build this solution in partnership with Boston Children's Hospital and Harvard Medical Research to build a solution which people could opt in to help with data tracking around COVID incidences across the United States. And in the Drupal community, the Drupal Association is at the heart and core of what keeps the community going and alive and connected. And as the Drupal Association has a high dependency on in-person events, the community really rallied together to keep the Drupal Association afloat. And we were able to raise enough funding to keep Drupal Association alive because of 150 businesses and 2,000 individual members who contributed to the Drupal Association. And that's important right now because there are many, many organizations who really depend on Drupal who are right now in the front lines of this battle that we have with COVID-19. And when it comes to belonging at MongoDB, our premier developer event, MongoDB World, is where we really strive to get to and really look forward to meeting with our community and our developers. Well, that too had to become virtualized, and we had that recently and became MongoDB Live. We decided in this to really lean into the reality of our experience today, and that we used to our event. And our keynote speakers were all in this Zoom-like gallery experience as part of the keynote experience, really reflecting what life is like today. And we even enlisted the help of one of our keynote speakers' children to help close out the keynote with her own custom-made exit note. Some of the most creative solutions come from community members, such as the DevOps community here, where Austin actually used his favorite gaming platform to create a virtual trade show booth. And it was done in jest, but someone else in the community then said, well, hey, we should actually do that conference that we're going to cancel in Animal Crossings. Well, guess what? They did make that happen. And one of our own developer advocates, Adrian, actually presented her full presentation as herself, and in her avatar, there were other people in this virtual classroom of hers learning from her in this new virtualized format. And to boot, of course, she had MongoDB swag to share. And when I think about gaming and my own experiences with gaming, how appropriate. Gaming really knows how to scale, and what a great opportunity to keep the conference going even in this virtualized format. So back to Han Solo, being frozen in time in carbonite. And I feel this way right now during this pandemic, that we're all sort of frozen, waiting for things to be normal again. But the reality is that normal, we're going into a new normal of things. And so we can't keep being frozen in time like this. We can be together while we are this far apart. In fact, we are so uniquely positioned to do really great things in this broken world of ours. We have valuable technical skills that we can contribute to really make meaningful impact during this time. So whether it's really leaning in with our technical skills to battle this issue of COVID-19 all around us, all around the world, or helping with this battle on racial injustices that happen to Black Americans every single day in America, or whether it's to help our open source communities continue to thrive in the face of all of this that we are experiencing right now, because they too are also in their front lines, their users are in their front lines battling COVID-19 or helping with social injustices and writing those things. So I ask you to think about, if you're done with just learning, if you are done with just binge watching all the things And you're done with being exhausted with all those contemplative walks with your furry friends. Are you relating to any of this yet? Does this mean something to you? I hope it does. Because all of us as humans have a deep desire and need to belong. And I know it's hard right now in these virtualized formats, and I know it's hard being socially distanced. But really together, especially in tech, especially with all of us who can code and do things for good, you ask yourselves, where is everybody? Where is everybody? We are all still here. Our communities are still here, and they still need you to make a difference. The world needs you more than ever before. So I ask you, find your belonging in your communities again, because we're all here and we're all here together. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace. What a perfect note to end our morning session on. And thank all of you for being here. This is the end of our keynote sessions for today. Enjoy the rest of the event today, and I'll see you all back here tomorrow.